So our second to last set of video or recording is looking at the large intestine. So we just got done talking about how the pancreatic juices and the bile is secreted and released into the small intestines, and how that content is moved through the small intestines. Now, under normal circumstances, right, the small intestines would be in this kind of middle region here, okay? But it's been removed and it would come up, and the duodenum would be up here, and then the stomach would be up here, right? So on and so forth, okay? So the large intestines can actually be broken down into a number of regions. So here is our ileocecal valve. This is our ileocecal valve. This is the ileum of the small intestines, and this is the cecum of the large intestines. Now, what you can automatically see is the appendix is attached to the large intestines. However, where do you find the appendix in terms of organ systems, right? We actually now put the appendix, okay, in the lymphatic / immune system. So for the longest time, it was believed that the appendix had no function, but now they know, or now they have evidence that shows that the appendix actually has a function within the immune system. So our small intestine, that chyme will enter from the small intestines into our large intestines and will travel through these different segments of the large intestines. We have our ascending colon, which is this first region. We have our transverse colon. We have our descending colon. We have our sigmoid colon, and then we have our rectum. Our rectum will then lead into the anal canal, where we have an external and an internal anal sphincter, which we'll talk about here in a little while. One thing I do want to bring your attention to are these divisions. These divisions here are called haustras. And this is going to become important because we're going to talk about haustral contractions here in a little while. And what that means is these individual haustra undergo contractions. Okay? So the large intestine has a very thick mucosa. It's a simple columnar epithelium, and that's with the exception of the anal canal, where we see a stratified squamous epithelium. And again, just like the oral cavity and the esophagus, we have those areas are subject to abrasion, so is the anal canal. So that is made up of a stratified squamous epithelium. However, the large intestines have no circular folds, no villi, and no digestive secretions. That right there should automatically tell you what the large intestines does not do. It carries out very little or no absorption. We're not worried about absorption in the small intestines, okay? Because it doesn't have any of those features needed in order to increase absorption or increase surface area. It does have a lot of deep crypts with goblet cells, and these goblet cells are going to produce mucin, okay? So this large intestine produces a lot of mucus, and that's going to help move the undigestible food stuff through the large intestines, okay? Oftentimes when homeostatic imbalance associated with the kind of the large intestine, more the anal canal, is our hemorrhoids. And hemorrhoids are basically the superficial venous plexus of the anal canal. They become inflamed, and this is what causes hemorrhoids. So one thing about the large intestines is this amazing population of bacteria called our bacterial flora. This is also referred to in the scientific world as our microbiome. Okay. And although bacteria have often received a very negative rap, the bacteria that exists in our colon and our large intestines actually are good bacteria. At least you hope they're good bacteria. And so the large intestines is made up of this bacterial flora. The bacteria themselves will actually synthesize some vitamins, so vitamin B complexes and vitamin Ks, which is kind of crazy to think about, that we have this bacteria in our digestive system that is actually there to help us make vitamins. It will metabolize some of our host-derived molecules. So, for example, that mucin and heparin and hyaluronic acid that are basically going to be defecated out, serves as a nutrient source for these microorganisms. They will ferment indigestible carbohydrates. So carbohydrates that you haven't been able to break down, that reach the large intestine, are then broken down. And you can thank this bacterial flora for the generation, okay, and release of acids and gases, right? When we think about gas in the large intestines, we're talking about farts, right? So you can think about those bacteria chowing down on, are basically fermenting those carbohydrates, right? And that results in an increase in this gas production. So we look at the function of the large intestines, okay? Most food products will remain in the large intestines from anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. Again, there is absolutely no food breakdown in the large intestines. The only food breakdown that we kind of see is what's being carried out by the bacteria, that bacterial flora that I just talked about in the large intestines. However, we do have a little bit of absorption in the large intestines, mainly vitamins that are made by those bacteria, as well as water. So any remaining water that's still in, I shouldn't say remaining, we're still going to have water we get rid of. But if we need to reabsorb water that's kind of from the chyme that's entering into the large intestines can pull out that water at that location. And some electrolytes, mainly sodium and calcium, can be reclaimed within the large intestines. The major function of the large intestines is just to repel the undigestible byproduct of digestion absorption from which forms the feces to the anus, so we can defecate, so we can poop. Okay, you can remove the colon and you can survive. Okay, so if you think about it, right? So someone who has diarrhea, right, that means most likely that their colon isn't carrying out the process properly because it's not pulling the water out of that food stuff like it should be. So motility within the large intestines happens most specifically through those haustral contractions. So remember, before I showed you just a few slides ago, these independent segments, these are called haustra. So the haustral contractions essentially allow for kind of a slow segmenting movement. So you'll get a haustral contraction, right? So if they're kind of stacked, you get a haustral contraction, and then you get a haustral contraction, and then another one, and another one, and another one, and it goes transverse, right? And then down, right, to the descending and the sigmoidal, and that's how it moves that the undigestible byproduct through the large intestines. Now, there's a reflex called the gastrocolic reflex. This is initiated by the presence of food in the stomach. And what it will do is it will activate 3 to 4 really slow, powerful peristaltic waves per day within the colon, and these are known as mass movements. So a mass movement is essentially the events of defecation, i.e. pooping. Okay, so when we look at a few homeostatic imbalances within the large intestines before we get to talk about defecation on the next slide, if an individual has a low fiber diet, okay, what happens in a low fiber diet is the colon becomes narrowed, and when they undergo the haustral contractions and the reflexive mass movement responses, those result in really, really strong contractions that increase the pressure within the walls of the large intestines. And as a result of that, this can result in something called diverticula, which is basically a herniation of that mucosa. That mucosa that kind of starts to bulge out. Now, in the sigmoid colon, which is kind of the last little piece before we get to the rectum and the anal canal, you can get something called diverticulosis. Okay, and diverticulosis is basically an abundance of these diverticula, these herniations, and about people, you get them as you start to age. About half people over the age of 70 have diverticulosis. Now, if this diverticula becomes inflamed. Again, here's our itis word, inflammation. Okay, this can result in rupture, and what'll happen is that essentially fecal matter, right, empties into or leaks into the peritoneal cavity, and then basically contaminates the abdominal cavity, and this can actually be fatal if it's not treated. Okay, so diverticulitis is not something to take lightly, and can actually be very life-threatening if it ruptures. IBS, or irritable bowel syndrome, is also another homeostatic imbalance. It typically tends to be considered as a functional GI disorder, and characteristic with it is recurring abdominal pains, stool changes, bloating, flatulence, which is farting, nausea, and depression. Stress is a common precipitating factor. It occurs, so people who are super stressed ends up kind of triggering this IBS kind of phenomenon. So in looking at defecation, right, which is basically these mass movements that we were talking about, what happens is as that feces, okay, enters, right, so over here we have our ascending, our transverse, our descending, and here's our sigmoidal colon. Okay, so as that feces makes its way to the sigmoidal colon, what happens is the sigmoidal colon will distend. Okay, and what happens is as this distends, it sends a signal up to the spinal cord. Okay, so defecation is actually a spinal reflex. However, the great thing about the nervous system is that our brain can also have a role in this process, right? Because it's nervous system too, okay? Because what this distension does, this initial pathway does, okay, is it causes two things to happen in the sigmoid colon and in the rectum, okay? It causes the sigmoid colon to contract. Okay, so contraction, and it causes the internal anal sphincter to relax. And now you can say, oh shit, right? Like, we can say that, right? But the great thing is, no, we don't defecate yet, because we have conscious control, hopefully, over the external anal sphincter, which is holding the poop inside of us. Okay? So, I always tell students on this one, right? Like, students have asked me before, like, why, like, you have to go, right? And you have that urge, and, like, the minute you sit down, you're just like, oh. Same thing with urination, which we'll talk about in the urinary system, right? So, what's happened in that case when you've waited too long to go to the bathroom is this muscle, the sigmoid colon, the muscles within the sigmoid colon and the rectum are contracting. Your internal anal sphincter is like, hey, I'm ready to let it loose, okay? But you have that conscious control over the external anal sphincter. So when it's convenient, you hope, right? Over the toilet, you hope, okay? You basically decrease the impulses to this skeletal muscle, and when these external anal sphincters relax, defecation occurs. Okay, I put this one over here, this image over here, just so you can see this little bit difference. So this right here is the internal anal sphincter, and this is the external. So this is controlled by the sympathetic. The internal is controlled by the sympathetic, or I'm sorry, the parasympathetic. You do not have control over the internal anal sphincter. However, thank goodness, you have control over the external anal sphincter. Okay? And again, that's what controls, ultimately, that defecation process. Now, in addition to this defecation reflex, you also have something called the Valsavar's maneuver, and it's spelled Valsalvas, I think. I think this is how it's Valsalvar's maneuver. And this is the kind of reflexive response that you also get, in which we call it bearing down, right? So when you have a bowel movement or this defecation reflex, what you often see is kind of the closing of the glottis and the contraction of the diaphragm and the abdominal walls. And this increases the abdominal pressure. And then you get the levitator ani muscle, which is this guy right here, okay? It also contracts, lifting, okay, superiorly the anal canal, and allows the feces to leave the body. So this Valsalvar's maneuver typically overlays that defecation reflex, okay? We will move on to the physiology. Now, I was going to make another video, but so the physiology of digestion will cover the slides, but I'm not going to walk through the slides individually. I'm going to do the remainder of the slides as a drawing. Okay?